Since the 1950s, the supercarrier has been the most visible representation of US military power and maritime hegemony. Although supercarriers have participated in nearly every military conflict since the commissioning of USS Forrestal in 1955, no carrier has come under determined attack from a capable opponent. In part, this is because supercarriers are very difficult to attack, but the symbolic grandeur of the massive ships also plays a role. No one wants to know what the United States might do if one of its carriers came under attack. What would happen if a foe attacked a United States Navy, USN, aircraft carrier during a conflict? How would the United States react, and how would it respond? Circumstances obviously matter for an attack on a US aircraft carrier. An out-of-the-blue attack from a conventionally armed state actor would enjoy the highest levels of success, but would also have an impact on elite and public opinion in the United States that might drive calls for dire retribution. An attack as part of a crisis would seem less extraordinarily hostile, but would nevertheless incur demands for a severe response. Finally, an attack during active hostilities might well represent a significant escalation but would be least likely to elicit an enraged public response. Most devastating of all might be an attack by a non-state actor that resulted in significant casualties and/or the destruction of the carrier. This would undoubtedly inflame US public opinion while leaving the United States without a clear path for response and retribution. As part of an ongoing military conflict, an attack against a USN carrier would not necessarily represent a legal challenge. Aircraft carriers are weapons of war, after all, and they are just as vulnerable to attack as any other weapon. But as military theorists have pointed out for at least 2 centuries, states choose their levels of escalation very carefully. Most wars are limited wars, and in limited wars, generals, admirals, and politicians are aware of the political import of the targets they select. Consequently, some targets remain off-limits for states that want to keep a war limited, even if those targets make a material contribution to the conduct of the conflict. The United States has enjoyed, for quite some time, a perception of untouchability around its most cherished, expensive, and effective military assets. Even with conventional naval and air forces, attacking a supercarrier is no mean task. The USSR tried to develop effective anti-carrier weapons and tactics for decades, a pursuit that China has now taken up. But aircraft carriers have an almost mythic symbolic importance, both in global opinion and in the self-conception of the US Navy. No state has undertaken a determined attack against a USN carrier since World War II. Authorizing an attack against a USN supercarrier would require a weighty political decision. Political and senior military authorities might prefer to simply damage a carrier, which would send America a message about vulnerability, but that would not necessarily lead to the deaths of extensive numbers of US personnel. However, it would be difficult for anyone to guarantee limitations on damage, as a lucky shot might destroy the carrier. Granting the authority to attack a carrier would necessarily run the risk of sinking the ship. The USS Nimitz carries almost 6,000 American military personnel and represents a vast expenditure of American treasure. Attacking her, and thus endangering this blood-and treasure, is a very risky prospect indeed. The sinking of a US aircraft carrier might well result in casualties that would exceed the total losses of the Iraq War in no more than a few minutes. When capital ships sink, they sometimes take nearly every crew member with them. 1,415 of a crew of 1,418 went down with HMS Hood in 1941, for example.